Hello friend and welcome to another episode of the Bonsai Pot-cast by Blue Nose Trading. I'm your host, Tori Solis, and today I'm going to be talking with Hugh Grant of Tree Makers. Hugh is an Australian bonsai artist who's doing some incredible work with Australian native trees. Today, Hugh joined me to chat about the value of art school for developing artistic language, aesthetics of the urban landscape, ceramic artists in Australia, appreciation of bonsai at all stages of age, the function of the bonsai container, and so much more. It's an amazing artistic chat today, so let's dive right in. Alright, here with another episode of the Bonsai Pot-cast. I have the extreme pleasure of talking with Hugh Grant, an Australian native. He is of Tree Makers, and he's working out of Blue Mountain, New South Wales. Hugh, you studied sculpture and ceramics as a major in your university studies. How was that? I don't think we've ever unpacked much of your own ceramic history. I've heard you talk about your trees, but it looks like you started in clay.
Yeah, didn't necessarily, in the whole bonsai context, I didn't start necessarily in clay.
Oh, true.
But
yes.
although maybe actually, you know what? I kind of maybe accidentally lie about that, because one of the first ever art classes I ever did was as a 6 or 7 year old going to ceramic classes, funnily enough. Yeah, and I have one, well, I have a few of those pieces that I made as a little kid, sloppy little things here and there, but I have one sort of bowl that I use as a kusamono planting for a pitcher plant.
Nice.
so that's from way back when I think I was about 7 when I did those classes. But yeah, when I was at university, I went to fine art school basically because out of high school I didn't really know what to do with myself, as a lot of us do, right?
Yes.
And there was a few courses I wanted to get into. Originally, I actually wanted to get into architecture, but at that time in Australia, architecture had what we call an ATAR, which is your score to get into a degree straight out of high school.
Okay.
It was as high as medicine. So I didn't quite meet the cut, which was unfortunate, but I was really quite disappointed about that. And I was like, okay, what's another way that I could get into architecture? And one route was to do a creative degree, like a fine arts degree, and then bridge over a year or two later after doing the course. So I thought, I'll do that. So I signed up to a fine arts degree. Enjoyed it so much that I just stayed on. I was like, you know what, this is cool.
Yeah.
I'm just going to stay doing this. And through that, I got into doing ceramics, actually, pretty heavily. I was maybe 3 out of the 4 years that I was there, I was taking, at least 50% of my courses were all ceramic courses. So
Nice.
just really taking advantage of the ceramic studio time, which was an amazing opportunity. Having access to all those resources and not having to literally purchase anything. That was what was handy about it. Because ceramics, I'd imagine, is a pretty, I haven't really done much of it since then, but I imagine it would be fairly, like any hobby, fairly pricey to set up as your own.
There's a lot of access issues. I think that a lot of people have made this model, at least here in the United States, of a community studio that seems to be picking up popularity here. And those are really great because they're providing access to people who can just, work with clay and get classes. And it's this community setting, right? Because what we need access to is a kiln is the most difficult thing. So it gives people access to firing and wheels and teaching. It's great. Community studio access. But otherwise, if you don't live in a major city, it's kind of challenging because there are a lot of costs with getting into ceramics. Did you like to throw when were you?
Yeah, that's what I predominantly did. I think that's, if it's hard to remember why I really got into it at that time, but I think because for the first year we had to do basically every discipline, painting, printmaking, sculpting, photography, ceramics. So we had to do a course in each thing, and that's what was really beautiful about it. It was Newcastle University, which is kind of a few hours north of Sydney. And they had a phenomenal fine art degree. I don't think it exists now, unfortunately, but they had a phenomenal facilities and degree in which they had access to all kinds of studios. And the first year you had to do everything. And then from there, you basically specialized, picked courses that you wanted to do, major, minors, kind of a thing, which was amazing because a lot of other fine art studios didn't really offer that kind of scope. Sorry, universities, not studios. So yeah, I think the first course in that sort of first year was just wheel throwing ceramics and pinch pot building, all the basics. And I really got into that and I loved it. And yeah, and just spent a lot of my time out in the ceramic. It was a quiet little corner of the uni, so I'd just sit there and just be like throwing things, and it was funny because I guess there's a bit of a dogma in fine art schools. They don't want to be coined as potters; they want to be ceramicists, right? So wheel throwing kind of pushes you very closely towards this pottery sort of terminology, as opposed to a ceramicist, more sculptural work. So the lecturers were always very hesitant to encourage people to throw. Mm-hmm. They wanted you to get that skill, but they didn't want you to just throw things and call it good. So anyone who tried to make a bowl or tried to make something that had any kind of resonance towards functional wear, they would criticize and shun and be like, no. But I managed to create an artist statement that basically my artist statement for the 2 or 3 years that I worked on ceramics at uni was to explore the bonsai pot and to explore sort of its functionality versus its aesthetic kind of crossover.
Oh, that's nice.
And I would make bonsai pots, like on the wheel, throw things, but I would try and do like some very my main first concept was to create ornamentalization on the underside of the container where the feet are. So I would create elaborate patterns and elaborate sort of explorations of texture and things like that on the underside, in which in a functional context no one would ever see. But from a sort of more of a conceptual context was sort of talking about, the part that you don't see. Is it really functional wear if you have to, I guess, interact with it on that sort of underside, and which would be in functional wear considered obsolete or non-existent because it sits on that base. So that was kind of the way I got my foot in the door of being able to throw for 3 years and it'd be okay.
Nice. That's to me, it's unfortunate that they wouldn't encourage throwing, because my experience as a ceramic artist has been that if you actually want to make money as a ceramic artist, you're gonna, well, there are lots of paths. I don't want to say it's the only path, but a very clear path is to throw production on the side.
Sure.
And that's a path I'm on. I know there are lots of ways to be successful, but like I throw a lot of production cups and mugs on the side, and then I also do this, I guess the ceramic artist quote unquote part of like where I like to I develop and make glazes and do sculptural work and stuff. So it's kind of like, I don't know, but I've heard this before where people are like, oh, you're a potter, and I'm like, oh, am I? I mean, I do sculpture, I like my pottery. I mean, I throw, I sculpt. It's weird that we draw these lines, but I guess we like to have our labels. They make us comfortable and safe.
Yeah, I think from the university perspective, it was to try and like just push people out of the box, to be like, hey, like just don't get stuck in this one avenue, and like you and I know, that one avenue isn't a linear place. Like it does have an immense amount of creativity involved. But I think it was just their way of saying like, try everything else as well, please. We want you to really explore the medium and not just be on the wheel. And it's not to say that you can't get to conceptual or use that wheel throwing process at the start to lead you into a sculptural work. But I guess they were just trying to like really break people away from that resonance towards something that is more utilitarian than conceptual.
I think that might be part of what their job is as academic art too, right? Like to teach you to think like an artist, maybe, so that they're like, if you want to throw and practice this craft, get a wheel and go sit in your room for 6 hours a day or whatever, and throw pots off. So I could see that.
Yeah, and I think like I remember a lot of people really pushed against that because they'll grumpy about it, they just wanted to make fun things. And that was across the board in uni. Like I always observed there was this real tension of like, either it was like, I just want to use the studios to make things that I want, because artists are creative people, so they want to have freedom in a sense. And fine art under an academic context is less about freedom and more about developing skills. And I would say mainly on this conceptual side, because the mechanics side of things, the physical making of work, I would say in a way you could learn that anywhere. You could go work with another artist, you could go to a studio, wherever that, a metal working studio, you could just go and learn those skills. But what you're really getting out of a fine art context is the ability to articulate, explore, and sort of give yourself a way or a tool, a language to be able to go out in the world, observe the world, and then, I guess, re-amalgamate that into something conceptual that makes commentary on that world. I remember there was one lecture that I went to, because we did a lot of our courses were theoretical lectures where they would just talk about all sorts of different things. And one of the courses was on aesthetics. Mm-hmm. And I can't remember exactly the way the lecturer said it, but she said, really what fine art school is giving you is the ability to, or giving you the skill set to visually analyze. And visual could be interpreted in terms of auditory or touch or sense, all the senses, but visually be able to look at the world and not just say, hey, I see a leaf on a tree, that's a leaf on a tree, but be able to then think about and understand and be able to reproduce in another medium what might that leaf on that tree represent in the greater scheme of the world, and what does it say about life, or whatever to look at things and think something other than just wheelbarrow, block of clay, just to have that language. And I had a really profound sense of like, oh, I understand why I'm here now. This is crazy awesome, because all of a sudden it wasn't about, oh, you're just here to make art. It's like, oh, I'm here to learn something quite useful in life, which is to be able to see beauty, see information, see interest, see something other than just literally what's in front of you, but be able to like interact with it in a certain sense. And that sort of blew my mind open, and that was a really, really amazing moment. And after that, I had less of that perspective of fine art being like, oh, like I'm at this school and they're trying to get us to do all these things and I'm not super into it, to like, oh, this is like everything that I do here is pushing me towards gaining a greater understanding of the world around me, just through a visual means.
Do you think that for some people that kind of understanding and knowing comes a little bit more intuitively?
Yeah, I think like any skill set, every human in the world has something that they're better at than others, and some things that you have to push for more than others. So I think some people, have more of a propensity to naturally be able to fall into that analytical mode, maybe a bit more easier than others. Yeah. And others have to really work for it. I think that exists. I think it would be silly to say that, it doesn't exist. There's definitely a natural degree for others than more than others, but yes. But I don't think that says that no one can't think that way.
Oh, for sure.
It's just how do you get to that place?
Absolutely. So how do you feel, and how would this affected, and how would you describe your personal aesthetic within your own work now? I know it's mostly coming out in trees more than as a medium rather than in ceramics these days. So
yeah, and based on that access to material, purely the reason I don't do ceramics majorly since uni is just because of access to materials. I got out of uni, I was like, okay, if I really want to do ceramics now, I have to really like gear up or find a studio or whatever, which I sort of jumped straight into bonsai practice immediately after uni. I went and did my studies at Bonsai Mirai in America, over in the US, and then pretty much started my career straight after that in bonsai. So I hadn't really had time to do ceramics after that, which is a shame, because I really loved it. Really loved it.
You're still young, so there's still time for you to have a whole career in ceramics.
Absolutely. It's not over yet. Definitely something I'll do on the side for sure. Sorry, what was the original question?
I was just wondering how you describe your own personal aesthetic and style.
Yeah. That's a crazy question.
I know. Sorry. That's what I'm here for, to ask crazy questions.
That's good. How would I describe that? Gosh, that is such an interesting question. I've never.
It's all right. When I look at your work, I definitely see, as far as from a bonsai style perspective, trees in styles that are. It's incredibly inspirational work to me. A lot of the line and the motion, especially your work with just line. It's amazing. And the Australian natives too have their own energy. I love what's happening in Australia, which was why I chose you as one of the artists I wanted to talk to.
Oh, thank you. I was wondering how you found me, and
I've been following you for a while, and I really like the trees that I see coming off the Tree Maker's Instagram.
Thank you. Yeah, I guess the why I'm fussing over this question right now is because I guess I'm trying to sum up what might influence my practice across the whole board of creativity. But I guess if we narrow it down to bonsai, yeah, for sure. Like, definitely have an interest in line. I'm a pretty lanky guy, so I don't know if that influences
maybe.
that. I empathize with the trees. No, like, yeah, I've always been, I don't know, if you visit the Australian landscape, what you do notice is I think there's an inherent line-based influence in the landscape. You know, Australia is predominantly an arid subtropical climate for the most part. You know, there's all other sorts of climates, but we're pretty far north, so we have a lot of that ecosystem. I think that makes a lot of the native trees that have adapted to this landscape over millions of years have a stretch inherently to them, more so than maybe the northern hemisphere shows, because the northern hemisphere is a lot more north relatively, so there's a lot more compaction to the trees. Yeah, and these things are minor, but that's definitely something I've observed. You even see it in, like, I mean, where I'm sitting right now looking out of my office, there's radiata pines, which are from California, right? And they have a bit more of a stretch to them. They're quite old, 100 years old, these trees. But they have a bit more of a stretch to them than I observe radiata pine did in California itself. So there is something about this climate that creates a lot more of a line-based attitude towards trees. And I think articulating that through my bonsai work has always been really interesting, because I think when I practice bonsai on a personal level, I'm really, really fascinated in, I guess, literally showing what's around me in my environment, which is, I find super fascinating, because a lot of people will coin my work as quite abstract or having this element of otherworldliness. But what I find fascinating about bonsai, and I think this is where I'd like to see more people maybe interact with bonsai, is when you see my work, and this is me speaking for myself, not anyone else speaking about it, but I feel like it's quite true to form, whether it's an exploration of that true to form or actually hit it on the nail on the head, you know, is varied across the board. Yeah, I'm literally trying to show what I see in the landscape. And I guess from someone who maybe hasn't seen this landscape, or even people who live in Australia who haven't really thought about bonsai as a replication of the environment around you, but more trying to copy bonsai that they see elsewhere. When you think about the first part of that, replicating the environment around you, it can seem abstract, because there is a slight difference to the aesthetic for sure than there are maybe with northern hemisphere aesthetics, which are more common, or more common, so you're more relatable, you know, in a sense. Yeah, so I'm really interested in just going, hey, like, what do I see that's interesting in the landscape through the tree, and then just trying to make that. It comes across as abstract, which is fascinating, you know. But I'd love for people to be able to look at it and go, oh, wow, okay, this is a portal to that landscape, which I haven't noticed, seen, or been to.
Well, Australia looks beautiful in pictures. I think a lot of us are scared of it. I play this game. I don't know if you'll know what this game is called or not. Some people listening may, some may not, but it's called Ark Survival, and it's basically a game where you're just thrown into this world naked, and there's dinosaurs, and you have to just survive, and they're like these hardcore maps. And I was like, I was looking up where you live, and I was looking up your climate, and I noticed when I was looking at Australia that, like, all the cities are on the outside, and I'm like, what's happening in the middle of Australia? Like, what's going on in there? And then I looked up an eco-region map, and I was like, oh, it's an Ark map. It's just a big survival video game in the middle of Australia, like.
Yeah, it's kind of like, I guess it would be like the deserts of, like, Utah. Yeah. But it's most of the country.
It's beautiful.
And it's the same size as the US. And it's just, that's the crazy thing. It's the same size as the USA, which I don't think a lot of people in the US actually realize how big it is.
Oh yeah. It's a big it's because on the world map it made Australia look weird because y'all are down in the southern hemisphere, and I think it was something about it translated weird. To where the way that
smaller. Distortion of trying to put a circle on a flat surface.
It was something
like the way Russia is like 4 times the size of it actually.
Yeah, exactly. Sort of thing. Something weird like that. Yeah. But Australia, though, lots going on, all on the outside.
Yeah.
Beautiful landscapes. I was looking at a national park that was way over on the what is it? West. It's west to me. I don't know if things get flipped around, but
no, it's the same.
Super nice. So. this landscape is affecting your work, and how does it affect your choice in container?
Great question. Yeah, I have a lot of my thoughts have changed around this over time, as you do with any creative practice, and will continue to change. But yeah, I think something that I see on the Australian landscape, and particularly something I like to look at in ceramics, is I guess more of a delicate feel to the body, but quite a contrasty, rich texture and or color to the actual surface is something that I really like to pair with a lot of Australian trees with their ceramics, which I probably, there's a few people who work with, like Jared Bailey from Montaigne Bonsai in Tasmania, amazing friend of mine, and we talk about this a little bit, and I think he would probably agree with this aesthetic notion. But yeah, they're generally, because Australia is quite a dry, rugged, some would say rough landscape. Yeah, the people of Australia, we have a hardness about us, I think, for sure.
I've read the history.
Yeah. The history is fascinating. It's gnarly. You know, a lot of Western culture in Australia is built off of colonialism, but mainly convicts being sent here. So the largest part of the population has been built from people who were convicted criminals, whether rightfully or wrongfully. There's a sense of gnarliness there in the people, for sure. That's come from that time. Yeah, I feel like the landscape has a feminine quality to it. I think the Australian landscape, to me, if I had to describe it, which might be contrary to what a lot of people would say, but I think when you dig deeper into it, there's this line-based feeling to it. There's a delicacy but a strength all at the same time. And there's kind of like a willingness to adapt. And I think those things are super beautiful. And there's a real contrast in those aesthetics, for sure. So I find in my container, for the most, this is like obviously not every situation, but for the most part, that's what I really look for. And interestingly enough, I actually have been exploring a lot of sort of older Japanese containers for this aesthetic, because you do see this real beautiful delicacy in the shape, pairing with really sort of patinaed textures, glazes, or more of your more Nanban aesthetics seem to suit so well for Australian trees. And there's a few ceramicists in Australia themselves who very successfully meet this aesthetic, which is really, really great. Like Marambung Ceramics, Tracy Francis, Sue McFarland, Melbourne. They both hit that nail, I think, really well. Oh, Ben Richardson from Ridgeline Pottery. Not necessarily a bonsai ceramicist, but I have a few of his pieces that Jared has actually commissioned or sort of influenced in him making. Beautiful wood-fired pieces. Beautiful, strong, again, contrast. Strong but delicate, sensitive shapes with that beautiful, rich, almost like pastel wood-fired texture. Pastel colors, shininess, ash. It just suits to a T, I think. If you had to generalize the Australian aesthetic, really, really beautifully. Who else comes off the top of my head as a ceramist? Oh,
I know there's like Bad Swan Ceramics is one.
Yes,
that's
who I was trying to think about.
I think it's
Brendan Norton. Brendan Norton.
Yes.
There you go. Thank you for.
That's actually one that I follow. I'm going to have to go look up the others for sure, but I followed Bad Swan for a long time, and Brendan's amazing. Yeah, his work is definitely a major influence in my work. Every time I see him, I like give him a little imaginary fist bump in the world of speckled clay bonsai potters. I'm like, speckles for life, Brendan.
Yeah. He loves playing with that, and a lot of people do play with that kind of clay that has that texture inside of it that melts. There's a few different clays. Like there's a company called Keen's. Which are actually located where I grew up. So that was the clay I accessed when I was at uni. But they do a clay called Toast. And it's a good name because when you fire it, it looks kind of like toast, right? With the speckles all through it. Pretty you definitely end up with some beautifully smooth hands after throwing with that for a while. But you can only throw a few pots before you got to give up for a few days. Maybe after a few years of doing that, you'd be fine. But Brendan Norton, I actually had when I woke up this morning, there was a box on the porch of some pots from him.
Oh, nice.
Speaking of the guy. So I was like, why can't... I'm just so bad with names. Even if I can know someone's name, and if I have to recollect it, all of a sudden, I'm like, oh yeah, who's that guy I've known for years, or who's my best friends, and I'm terrible like that. But yeah, Brendan's pots are awesome, and I've really loved watching his journey. He's improved like rapidly. Like it was only a few years ago I first saw his work, and I bought one of the first pieces I saw him put up for sale that I could get hold of. Mm-hmm. And at the time I was like, this is cool. But reflecting now, and this is nothing against Brendan, but his pots are so much better now, and it's so good to see that progression of his work and reflecting more of his environment and his personal taste. And I think that's what I really appreciate about his work, is he is stuck true to who he is and what he creates and how he interprets his world. It's fantastic.
I agree. Absolutely. Something I saw on your website that I thought was super interesting, because it's something that I've also been thinking a lot about. Because of where I live, I'm in Texas, and also like Texas and Australia, like we share some resonance. Like we're both kind of spicy people and some spicy land. Like, so it's very similar. I've always kind of felt this way every time I meet and talk to somebody from Australia. But the thing is, I'm in Dallas, and Dallas is huge now, and it keeps continuing because it's in a prairie, so it keeps expanding across the prairie.
No limits.
It's this giant, unlimited urban sprawl. And when I first moved here 10 years ago, I lived in like what would be considered a small town, you know, with some like cows. And now it's like a whole city with like all this development around me and stuff. And I just thought it was interesting that you had mentioned the impact and studying that impact of like urbanization on trees. And when I look around and walk around the city of Dallas and in the urban landscape, and I see these trees that are living in like essentially a pot, right? Because like they're surrounded on all sides by roads and buildings, and all they've got is like just this little square plot of land basically to grow. And I know that they reach farther and all that, but it's still like a very small thing. And then the way that people are treating them too, like there's so much. We are this force of nature, in my opinion. And we come through and we're like, oh, we need the electric lines, can't have tree branches on them, and like just like and shave up the side. And like I look at these trees and the way that they react to this and grow, and I'm just like, these are different and affected. And it's just an interesting concept to me. That's kind of what I see when I'm looking at like these urbanized trees. Like when you grow up against the side of a wall, so you only have branches on one side or something crazy. Like, so what does that mean to you? Like, what were you kind of thinking?
I love that you brought this up. This is such a good topic because, like, I personally think it's really important not to think of us as humans upon the natural world, but to think of us as just a part of the world, because we're in the world. Like, I think it's very egocentrical to think of us as like on top of it in some sort of sense. We're just a part of it. We just happen to do this thing that is very, you know, if you think about like, I don't know, a wombat makes a tunnel to nest in, or a bird creates a nest in a tree. We just do that on a very large, radical scale in a certain sense, impact upon the environment, change it, create new landscapes, which is the urban landscape. And for sure, like, I mean, I think bonsai aesthetics, I think where we connect to trees the most is trees on those marginal landscapes. So the edges of things. So like the coast, the high alpine, the river, the desert. These are like edges of landscapes where trees take on forms that create a sculptural quality that interact with life and death, whether it's physically or conceptually, but they show that age, antiquity, and dramatic shapes other than things that are harmonious and have like a certain, I don't know, a homogenization to them. They exist in those landscapes that are more gentle or easygoing. I think the urban landscape is another marginal landscape because, like you say, you know, it's I mean, it's a jungle gym.
Like, we're tough on a tree. What's tougher on a tree than living outside a Walmart? Like,
yeah, totally.
Y'all got out there.
Barren, dry, hot landscape in the summer. Not much water, or when water comes, it floods into those garden beds, you know, because it's on this hard surface. They're being pruned. You know, there's interesting wind that gets created in urban landscapes. Yeah, it's like a mountaintop in a certain sense, isn't it?
But also it's glitzy, right? Like it's urban. It's urban. And so when you think of an urban situation, you're thinking of like what? Like the city life, right? Like the glitz, the convenience, the club, there's the glimmer. So I feel like that like is something that I've been kind of thinking of and exploring, which also runs counterproductive to what we would normally expect out of a bonsai container, right? Is subdued and the natural landscape textures and stuff, and I love those, and I still make those too. But there's something in me that's like, what about this like glitz and glimmer and like something really shiny?
I love that.
And then styling a tree or something in it that also speaks to this like this is a tree you found outside of club whatever or something. I don't know, just kind of like this is a landscape and a container and it has a certain energy to it, and I don't know that it's necessarily like the best energy, but it exists, and I think that that's a statement worth looking at.
It's something to say, absolutely. I think that's just as valid as other aesthetics that maybe are more accepted in the common dogma, right? Yeah. That's fantastic. I love that, Tori.
It's just a concept I've been thinking on.
Yeah. Well, it makes me think about like this notion of like what I was just talking about. You know, a lot of the time bonsai is seemingly accepted through this idea of tree as antiquity. You know, trees on the edge of life or end of life or old. And I remember I was hanging out with Peter Warren like, oh gosh, it was ages ago, 5 years ago. He's from the UK, bonsai professional there, and he said to me, he were talking about like the age of trees and like what is represented in bonsai, and he was like what about like young trees, you know, what about like super juvenile young trees as being a form, which probably is something you'd see more especially in our sort of younger Western countries. In those cities you're going to see younger trees, you know, 100 years old max maybe, especially in my country. And that's an aesthetic to sort of play with. And when you pair a ceramic with that, putting it in an old, rugged pot,
yes,
whether it looks old or is old or has a rugged texture or, you know, whatever it is, maybe doesn't work. Maybe it needs to be fresh, sprightly, you know,
I love that I love that you're bringing this up, because I've been meditating on this as well, where like I've been thinking about, I listen to a lot of different bonsai podcasts and I'm here for what everybody has to say. But, you know, I'm kind of extremely new into the practice and with my trees. And, like, I'm at the point where, like, I'm really new and I really love my trees. And I know that they're not crap. Like, but also I was thinking about it from a philosophical concept, because I like to think too much. To be old is to have been young. And in a practice of mindfulness and presence, there should be appreciation for just where you are. And if we're trying to appreciate process, then we should appreciate the young trees that we're working on as much as the old trees that we're working on, because that's appreciation of presence. And if you're only appreciating old trees and you're not appreciating your young material, then you're kind of not present with that young material. You're in the future with what you think it could be, rather than being present with what it is today and appreciating it for that. And maybe what it is young. Maybe it's young and it needs a bright pink pot with purple speckles. I don't know. You don't know what you need when you're young?
Yeah.
You should see my photos. Embarrassing.
Yeah. All of us. I think we could all agree on that. I don't think any of us are like, oh yeah, when I was 13, I was there.
I was so
you know,
cool.
Peak aesthetic. We might have thought it at the time, but definitely not later on. But no, I think that's beautiful, Tori. I think that's exactly the mentality that we need to have around bonsai practice and how we pair ceramics with them. I know for me, like growing trees, say if we're talking literally a young tree that is not peak first iteration aesthetic of a show-ready tree, and you're starting it from young material, you know, there's this notion of like, oh, you got to get it thick, you got to grow it quick, you got to do all these things. And that's one way to get to that aesthetic, to get to a tree that's able to be designed, etc. But there's also the method, which I much more prefer, which is the slow growth method, which is develop the tree in the best way it can be, honoring that it has to move forward. But if it's a young bit of material, style it as a young bit of material, giving it the ability to develop forward, because that is how you should develop bonsai. It's not this, I got it to this point and now I hold it in stasis. That's not the way it works. So from a young tree, develop it as a young tree, honor its youngness, put it in a container that's going to allow it to develop, but not massive. Put it in something beautiful, something glitzy with pink polka dots, right? Show its young youthfulness. And over time, it's going to develop slowly. And that's one method in which, you know, you can develop trees like that in a colander or in an Anderson flat or something along those, a styrofoam box, whatever you're growing that tree in. But you could also grow that tree in a ceramic, right? That's and you see this, like I flick through like older Japanese magazines or Kokofuten books, and you see trees that have that younger feel, and they look very immature. Maybe a tree that you might see in a show in Australia or in America from more of a beginner hobbyist. You see those trees in those Japanese exhibitions, and what that is showing is that those trees, that was what was cool and good at the time, because that was the age of the material. And it's only now that we see this really old, rugged, Japanese maple was young then. Now it's an old, beautiful, just humble, set into itself composition. But it was like you're saying, it was a young tree once upon a time. And what's to say we can't go, hey, let's show this through bonsai.
Yeah, or just show
knowing
process.
that tree, and every day that tree is going to get closer to an older image. Inevitably, we can't stop that from happening.
And I think maybe it's just that the ceramics is such a process too. That to me it seems so simple and intuitive that bonsai should also just be such a process, because they're they're a partnership, and then they're also both processes. Although the tree arguably will go on hopefully forever, or a very long time.
Well, same with the ceramic. I'd say the ceramic even more so.
But the composition, I guess, the ceramic is completed though. Like the artist can't alter it much more after it's been finished.
No, I guess it becomes like a lot of objects. It only gets aged by the things around it, as opposed to it physically changing its form over time. Yeah. It becomes an artifact in a sense.
So since I'd listened to your previous podcast, and I wanted to ask you some more technical questions about bonsai containers. So we'll start with, why do we put trees into bonsai containers?
Great question. Why, in terms of
in terms of the shape, and why do we restrict the growth to a bonsai pot? What's happening?
Why do we choose that style of pot versus a tall nursery pot?
Exactly.
or a big large terracotta vessel or something like that? Yeah. So the bonsai container it's a super fascinating piece of ceramic, because from a horticultural perspective, it's a terrible place to grow a tree. To be very honest about that. There's a reason why if you go to a nursery, you will not see any pots that are shallower than they are higher, right? They're always higher than they are shallower, right? And that creates a gravity column which moves oxygen through the soil, moves water in and out very rapidly. It dries out on a uniform speed. And those things are very good for growing a tree in a container. A shallow pot does the opposite of that, right? Water sits in it very comparatively, sits in it for a long time. It doesn't move as well. Oxygen flow is harder to get in there. And that's why bonsai soils are a lot more aggregate, or a lot larger in particle size than you would use if you go to a garden center and buy a bag of soil. It's super fine, right? And it can be finer because all of those processes are a lot easier to occur. Water, oxygen moving through that system. So a bonsai container is a terrible place to grow a plant. But what it does create is a really beautiful minimal aesthetic relative to the tree. So it lets the tree sort of be more mature, because you have, I feel like the wider than deeper aesthetic, for the most part, gives the tree the ability to sit on the landscape in a way. And you do see pots that are slightly deeper than they are wider, like a cascade or a semi-cascade style container. Even some of your deeper drum style pots, they might be quite deep or close to their actual width. But they're trying to emulate environments that maybe are showing a little bit more height, potentially. But you don't really ever see a pot that's dramatically deeper than it is wider, right? Because I think when you start to take on that aesthetic, it starts to feel literally very horticultural, as opposed to more abstract. Because I think it's fascinating what I had a thought earlier and I forgot about it, but bringing it back up again on that notion of containers and this idea of like young containers and things like that. The bonsai pot, I think it's funny sometimes we have communications with different bonsai artists and different people, and there's a discussion of like naturalistic or abstract. And abstract always gets pushed into this realm of like trees that are planted on slabs or rocks or freeform containers. And traditional or more acceptable is a tree in a container. But really, the container is the most abstract thing of all. Planting a tree on on a more organic form of a container is more literal. So I think it's interesting that this is the way we communicate around bonsai. The pot is a very abstract place, but in that it creates a conceptual, I think, understanding that we're trying to show and contain environment, because we can't plant a bonsai in the ground and call it good. We have to represent that greater environment, and that shallow column of that container, wider than deeper, places the tree in the environment while also being a pot to house the root system in a very functional way. There's nothing more functional than the pot. It's easy to pick up, it's easy to move around, it contains the soil very well. Yeah, but the pot is quite abstract in a sense. It's very much a conceptual way of saying this is landscape. But yeah, the bonsai pot, it's a unique piece of ceramic pottery in a certain sense from a functional perspective inside of the plant world. You won't find containers like that for many other plants. But yeah, understanding what it does, and because we then use those aggregate soils, it means we have to explore soils that do maybe contain that root system for a long period of time. Because a bonsai container also, we want it to, especially when we're sort of more on the latter stages of aesthetic, when we're not trying to grow the material too much larger, we are housing our trees in, you know, what you might say are relatively small living arrangements compared to maybe other plants, because we're trying to create a more mature, divided tree in terms of its branch proliferation inside of that space. So we're trying to fill that space with as much root mass as possible, so that we can create it, really convince that tree that it's an old growth tree far before its time. And containing the root system really sets that up, because I think, you know, when a tree is allowed to grow freely, it will grow freely until it reaches whatever mechanical ability it has to reach that certain size where it can move water and resources up and down. Once it hits that size in which it can't do that anymore, it starts to mature, it starts to move into closer to that old growth form, in which it starts to get wider than it does higher. And the bonsai container being a restricted environment, but still enabling fine root duplication over time, means that that tree becomes an old growth form way before its time. You know, there's no reason why you can't have a 10-year-old tree look as old as a 500-year-old tree to a degree. And a big part of that's the container, for sure, in terms of slowing down that growth and enabling it to sit in that environment. Yeah. So a fascinating place, the bonsai pot.
Yeah. So when is it time to put a tree into a bonsai pot and move it out of its training pot into something else, or is this just a shift of size, really? Or if we're considering deeper bonsai pots, maybe you could move it into a drum or something even sooner, if you just wanted to look at it?
Yeah, well, I think this ties into the few past questions that you've asked, because I think this comes down to when you shift that tree into that quote unquote bonsai container is really, I think predominantly it's a statement of saying, I want to compose this tree. I want to show it. I want to appreciate it for what it is at this point in time. Now, because it is horticulture, everything is preemptive and proactive, right? You know, if I'm going to house a tree in a pot today and I need that restriction of the environment, potentially I'm going to be doing this a few years before it reaches that level in which it's presentable in that container. So there's always this long-term approach. But, you know, whether it's that actual ceramic that is what you want to see that tree in terms of reaching your concept for that piece, or it's a container that is similar in size. Yeah, it really depends on what your developmental goals are, for sure. You know, because this is why I like the slower growth approach to construction, because the root system is always closer to the size it will always eventually need to be than further, as opposed to maybe some other growing approaches where the root system has to expand very heavily, and then there's a long period of time of retracting that root system. So, and that makes that slower growth approach means that you can use the aesthetic of the container to, like we were saying, showing younger trees as younger trees at that peak potential that they are as a young tree. You can do that when you have that slower growth approach, because the root system is able to be contained. But it's, yeah, when you move it into that container, I would say is when you're wanting to present that piece, right?
Nice.
So long as that container can be proportional. Yeah, I think it's as simple as that. And you can dive out into the complexities of different methods of production growth and when you put that tree in that pot. But really, that's it, But I know for me personally, lately, I've actually been putting a lot of, because I mainly focus on a lot of broadleaf trees. The Australian landscape is dominated by broadleaf evergreen species. If you had to pick a genre between conifer, broadleaf evergreen, and deciduous broadleaf trees, broadleaf evergreen is our predominant species, which is quite unique. I think is more common in the southern hemisphere than the northern hemisphere, but it means there's more of this deciduous approach to development. So I'm finding that really developing a very robust root system, maybe in a container that develops that, like a heavily aerated colander or a heavily aerated, what you guys call an Anderson flat sort of type container, where it has the same size and space and proportions as closer to what maybe that final ceramic or other equivalent might give you. But it means you can sort of really rapidly develop a very robust, strong root system to support this very high water moving, fluctuant, ephemeral foliage system. And I've been finding that to be a little bit more helpful in those early development stages. And I'm talking about design, not developing structures, but actually designing the trees as bonsai images. I actually am finding that really useful. So going back to that deciduous approach, as opposed to, I think, a lot of approaches I've applied has been more lately, as over the last few years, has been more of that conifer approach, in which you might Yamadori conifer. The first move after that collection container is drop it into the ceramic that is close to, or maybe is the ceramic you want to present that tree in 10 years' time. But conifer root systems, they're coarser, they move more, they need more oxygen, they develop a little bit more slowly. There's a different relationship to why you shift a tree into a container than a broadleaf tree or a deciduous tree. And that's a shift I've only made this year, and it's really sort of, I'm still playing with that as to what are my trigger points, especially when teaching why, when, and how, right?
Yep.
I'm still trying to formulate that. But there's definitely a very deciduous approach to a lot of Australian species and aesthetics, which means maybe taking the container out, the ceramic container out of it, the equation, and shifting it more into that space towards the latter ends of its refinement. Just something I'm playing with lately.
Yeah.
Which is, first time I've shared that.
Oh, good. I'm sure everyone will find it insightful.
Yeah.
I do that too. I think of things and I'm like, I just now thought of this, but I'm saying it for now, forever.
Yeah. I mean, discussion's so important.
Yeah, it helps you work new ideas out that you didn't
Absolutely.
even have fully fleshed out yet. I do that all the time.
Yeah.
It's great.
Totally.
So how can we, as ceramic artists, what can we do to elevate a container functionally?
That's a good question, Tori. I like these. Yeah, I think from a functional perspective, I guess always I would say my advice to any ceramicist doing bonsai would be to always consider, probably equally, consider that functionality and that aesthetic quality. Like really play on those two things, but don't compromise one for the other. I think that's I think when you see a ceramicist hit that sweet spot is when the functionality becomes a part of the aesthetic and the aesthetic becomes a part of the functionality. They're not separate things. It's not this beautiful crafted container and then it's on some very rudimentary feet, right? That are just stuck on there because I need feet, right? For a functional perspective, because I remember that this is a pot, right?
Oh my God.
I think, you know what I mean? Like the feet become a huge part of the functionality, but they're pivotal to the aesthetic, right? They're elevating the container. And that's just one example, but I think that would be my biggest piece of advice. Consider those things equally and marry them together. Make them be a very functional relationship, right? Yeah. And obviously, in that functionality, I think when it comes to a bonsai container, because it is shallow, more drainage the better.
Yeah.
I think if you're just thinking function, as many drain holes as you can fit in that don't obviously alter the aesthetic or the functionality of the pot's firing ability. Tie down holes are fantastic. Having as many tie down holes as possible, because especially with more elaborate designs, having more tie down positions are really, really helpful. placing those in areas around the container, not just in the center, but on the outside, and maybe positioned in strategic places so that, maybe they're behind feet predominantly, not entirely, but predominantly, like all little things like this. So again, playing with like, I know that I need this to function, but I also know that this has to be an aesthetically beautiful item.
Nice. Very important. I focus on function a lot, so it's very good. I do a lot of drainage holes.
Awesome.
Awesome. Well, we're coming up here around the end of my questions. Did you have any questions for me?
Ooh, okay.
Twisty.
Yeah, plot twist. This is good. Yeah, I guess like where do you? Very broad question, but like because I've looked at your work on your Instagram page.
Oh.
Like where do you see your practice going, and what influences you to make bonsai ceramics other than owning some bonsai trees?
I don't know where I'm going. I'm just going. Every day I'm just trying to meet new people, watch cool stuff, look at what cool artists are doing, and then, take in that information as well as just the information from the world around me, and then just keep making pots. It's kind of just a journey through iterations to see what comes out. I don't know exactly where I'm going. I follow these ideas and concepts and kind of see what comes out of them and, just see what's going. As far as my ceramic practice overall, I mean, I'm a potter. I do the pottery. I have a little small pottery business, not doing necessarily the bonsai pots so much but the mugs and stuff. So I'm going to keep potting and hopefully I'll be able to keep just throwing and throw faster and throw consistent and even and have less failure. I'd like to make larger pots with less failure. I have a lot of failure right now, especially with ovals and things that are bigger than about 13 inches give me a lot of trouble. So
I'm sure. Practice makes perfect.
Yes. I think it comes down to some technicalities with drying.
Sure.
So I've just got to figure it out. So I think just getting better as at a craft level and being able to translate and continue to work out that art part is basically the goal. Yeah. And I mean, I guess I'd like to
work
sell
out
them.
that conceptual part over time.
Basically.
Yeah. And I think that's super wise, Tori. Like being able to focus on your functionality maybe primarily, because at the end of the day, if it's not functional, it doesn't matter how beautiful it is.
I also think of my work as kind of loose and tight. So I like working a little bit more wet, I think, than most people. And what it ends up doing is it causes a lot of these droopy things and these wiggles, and I like them. So I really like that, and I don't know what to call it, because I'm like, this isn't non-bond, because those were something kind of different, but it is a little more, what I've been calling is like organic. It's like a loose and tight, like, so I throw these really tight cylinders that when I throw them, they're like straight walled and nice, and then I'm a little more loose with how I handle them, so that they end up just a little, like, they go a little one way on the rim or something, but not to a point where they're nasty looking, but like, I just think they're really...
beautiful.
Each one has its own kind of energy to it, so...
Yeah. And that's fascinating you bring that up, because I think sometimes the wobble especially in the bonsai container world, can be considered maybe, unless it's a non-barn, can be considered kind of like, not the best aesthetic to play with, or it doesn't feel as intentional. But I think, like, again, when I was at uni, this was another profound thing that was shared with me by the lecturers, was a good artist... This is not exactly the way to define it. I say this different every time, but a good artist shows proficiency through repetition of process and practice. So if you make a wobbly container one-off and it comes out wobbly, it's kind of like, oh, well, that's wobbly, right? But if that becomes something you hone and you push and you say, this is something I'm choosing, which is sounds like that's what you're doing.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm choosing to hone this. Inevitably, over time, just that consistency of practice and the abundance of literal items made, something starts to happen. And I've seen this in lots of different artists across all different mediums. Something happens where all of a sudden, that thing that maybe is like, I don't know where this is going, starts to just become, it becomes its own thing. It becomes the world in which that artist sort of centers themselves around. And all of a sudden, it's like, there's something changes and it becomes very profound. And I've seen that happen with a lot, especially ceramics. There's a ceramicist named Nicolette Johnson. She's from Brisbane. I think she's actually an American who lives out here now in Brisbane. Beautiful. I love her work. Nothing to do with bonsai. She makes
no worries.
sort of fine art vaseware. Yeah. But when I started following her Instagram page, like, I can't remember how many years ago, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, and she had like 300 followers or something. And there was this it was weird. It was kind of weird work. She was doing like sticking things on these vases, and it was really like, and I was like, I kind of like this, because I flicked through a page and it was like again and again and again and again. And it didn't feel like great. But now, like 5 or 6 years on, you look at her body of work. This is what's great about Instagram. You can flick through someone's body of work over time, right? It's profound, and it's very sought after now, right? Because she's just stuck to this very simple concept. And this is brutalizing her concept, but smaller items stuck to larger items, right? It's definitely not what her concept is, but maybe it is. I haven't spoken to her personally, but it's become this profound, beautiful, just like great aesthetic, and it says a lot of stuff, and it's so simple. But she stuck to it over time and honed that, and now that is her, and that's so interesting. And you see that a good artist, that's what happens, right?
With my work, I just feel like that's just what I want it to be, and it's authentic. And I think about it, and I'm like, well, I know how to not make it wobble, but I choose to.
That's important.
Do it the same way anyway. And also,
you're making an intentional choice.
It's sort of intentional and non-intentional. It's like an intentional looseness. Like, I'm not trying to like to be super intentional is like to look at it and slap it and be like, now you're wobbled. Like, that's too forced. Like, it's more like I know in my head, I'm like, this is really wet on the wall still, and if I cut this off right now, I'm going to ripple the wall. And I do it anyway, like knowing that that's going to happen. I don't know how it's going to ripple the wall exactly, but I know that it's going to cause the wall to kind of woople. And I think that basically, now that I'm thinking about it, one of those things I haven't ever thought of out loud until now is that basically it's like, it's this concept of like these tight forms that are allowed to become organic through touch, and then glazed with these ridiculous glazes, because I love making glazes. And I also like raw body work too. So it's a lot of like, I mix in like that raw speckled body work with these glazes that I'm making with these like tight forms that are allowed to become more organic. And I don't know, that all feels like it resonates pretty well. So yeah.
I love that.
There's going to be two camps of people. There's going to be this camp of people that's like, Tori's pots are great. We love her colors and they're so real. We super vibe with them. And there's going to be this other camp who's like, Tori's pots are wobbly crap with weird glazes. And that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
They don't wobble when they're sitting on the table. No, it's just the rims, well, just to be clear.
Like you said, you're intentional about that and you're thinking about it. And I'll be excited to see where your work is in 5 years.
Oh, me too.
When you've honed those intentionalities and they've moved in the directions that they'll move into, that will be an exciting time.
I'm excited.
How long have you been doing ceramics?
About 3 or 4 years now.
Yeah, so you're still early on.
For sure.
Yeah,
lots of places to go, and this is just a snapshot of what I'm thinking about my work right at this moment. Like, who knows where I'll be, because the mind just runs and goes and takes, and as I receive new information, I change my mind and all kinds of stuff.
For sure. Yeah. That's creative process, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it has been amazing talking to you. Super great. I love these deep art conversations. Very valuable.
Me too. It's one of my favorite things to do. So I'll be happy to do it anytime you like.
Of course, we'll see. I don't know where this podcast is going. I think the theme is that I don't know where anything is going. I'm just doing it.
Sure. I think that's the best way to be, yeah.
As soon as I set an expectation, I allow myself to potentially be disappointed. So we're just going forward. Expectation
is definitely the route towards disappointment. I think the more freer we can be through what we do in life, the more open we are to change and new things coming our way that lead us in directions we never thought possible.
Absolutely. Well said, Hugh. Thank you for joining me. Let everybody know where they can find you and your work and your bonsai and your tree makers and all that online.
Yeah. So, you can find a lot of information on my website, treemakers.com.au. And you can find me on Instagram and Facebook. I think it's just @treemakers. Pretty sure, I think Facebook is @treemakers bonsai. But as soon as you find the bonsai, you'll know which one it is. But you can follow me there to see what work I'm doing, see what education I have on offer at my studio. and all bonsai services that I offer and curate towards people. So yeah, check it out.
Awesome. Well, thank you for joining me. Have a great day today.
Yeah, you too. All right, thanks for having me, Tori. Appreciate it.
Of course. This podcast is brought to you by Blue Nose Trading, which is me and all of my patrons. You can get early access to unreleased podcast episodes and YouTube videos by becoming a patron of my work at patreon.com/bluenosetrading. You can find all of my current available ceramic work on my website, bluenosetrading.com. For social media links and information about today's featured artist, be sure to check out the show notes. Thank you so much for tuning in this week. Remember that you have great ideas that are worth exploring, drink lots of water, and I will see y'all next time around.